Welcome to the Lazy Sunday live stream, where we save our letters from bishops and priests and things, usually for the weekend, especially for Sundays. I'm going to give you a few updates on things that happened this week. First, it's worth noting, happy feast of the Immaculate Conception. Yes, for your obligation reasons, for it being a holy day of obligation, the Vatican sort of transferred it to tomorrow. But the feast is today. Today is the feast day. Do you have to go to Mass tomorrow? Well, that depends entirely on your bishop, because the Vatican says yes, but a whole lot of bishops around the world have said, yeah, but no. So go check your diocesan website for details. It varies from diocese to diocese. And even in Rome, apparently, Francis essentially excused them from the obligation that he imposed on the rest of the church. So check with your local diocesan website. And I'll note something that I saw, I think it was Eric Salmons say on X yesterday, that it seems like the church wants you to go to Mass on Monday. So if your bishop has excused you from it, you should at least consider going, like actually seriously think about it if you are so able to. So happy Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And we'll start with what might be some good news. Catholic Sat posted this on X. Seriously, if you are not on X, formerly known as Twitter, you should get on there. It really is. There's a lot of battles there. Sometimes you're wading into some really seriously strange territory with some of the figures there. But Catholic Sat is a sort of an independent reporter of things going on at the Vatican. And he has this video of the Vatican Christmas crib and nativity scene and the tree as they were inaugurated. Let's spend a few minutes watching this together. Without the audio, the music is almost certainly copyrighted. It seems that they opted for something that looks at least a little more traditional this year than in years past. No David Bowie music video astronauts or anything this time. So you see the lights come on, and already it's recognizable as a nativity scene. That's not a bad thing. And they, of course, do everybody a disservice with this faraway shot here. We will try to get in a little bit closer to it. See, look, it looks like a nativity scene. I would like them to get a little closer to the face so we can actually get a better image of what the face looks like. There's the tree being lit up. Yes, it's okay to have a Christmas tree. I find people who don't think so kind of odd. If you don't know about the history of Christmas trees and why it was that the saints like St. Boniface and why they started those traditions, go look it up. It's an interesting tradition. Oh, the source on it's very interesting. But yeah, the Christmas tree is lit up, and better than what happened at the White House Christmas tree, if you heard what happened there. But there you get a close-up of some of the statues, so they do have detailed faces. They tend to have a stone look about them, which I think is an interesting choice, but I don't necessarily have a problem with it per se. It's just an interesting aesthetic choice. But it is identifiable as a nativity scene. So hooray for that. That is a good thing. And in fact, in some ways, there's a certain beauty about this, even though on a personal taste level, it's not the way I probably myself would have gone, but I also am not upset by this. So again, there's Our Lady. Reason prevails at the Vatican for, I think, the second year in a row. I think the last year's nativity scene wasn't bad. It was the 2 years ago that it was actually, I believe, the bad one, the 2022 nativity scene. But yes, this confirms the rumor ahead of time that I reported, I think, last weekend or the weekend before, that they were going with some sort of fisherman's theme, probably having to do with the papacy. Back to the Christmas tree here. Pictures of sleeping fishermen. I think you get the idea. So that is, I think, some good news from Rome for once. Now, for a bit of the news of the weird, God might be trying to send everybody a message. You see, Friday was the Feast of St. Nicholas. The Ponto Institute and a lot of other places reported on this, posted this on X. Yeah, it's Michael Hitchborn's organization. Francis is there with a bruised chin. Rich Rayo, who's a big fan of Francis, says, today at audience with Rome's diocesan choir, who will perform a concert for the poor tonight, the Pope arrived with a large bruise on his left chin. Vatican hasn't said anything about what led to the bruise. Prayers for a quick recovery. Here the Pope is seen greeting Monsignor Frisina. And you can kind of see that there. There are better pictures of it online. Reportedly, he actually hit his chin on his toilet or on his sink in his bathroom in just a normal run-of-the-mill accident. But as Lepanto Institute says, a bruised chin on St. Nicholas's feast day, the punchline really does write itself. If you're not familiar with that is, what that's a reference to, St. Nicholas, as the story goes, slapped the heretic Arius for insulting our Lord and for heresy. So maybe God's sending us a message. Maybe it's a coincidence. I will leave you to decide, but there is something at the very least deeply symbolic about that happening on the Feast of St. Nicholas. Now, some people challenged the story I did yesterday on the James Martin pilgrimage that the Vatican is hosting. Marco Tassati basically confirmed it, and I'm not going to go over the details of it, but we are now getting independent confirmation of it. So people saying, well, why aren't the credible news sites reporting it? I think, personally, I am long past the stage of believing most news sites of any kind are credible after the last couple of years of reporting on things, but a lot of them, like Vatican News and these others, will go out of their way not to report on it because they don't want to do anything that builds on the scandal that Francis is doing to the church. But we have Marco Tassati has reported it. He is a journalist with deep ties, deep sources in the Roman Curia. He gets a lot of news stories for anybody else breaks them from Rome, including he was the one who broke the Vigano letters in 2018 before anybody else did. Vigano went to him to break these letters, and then they went nuclear online afterwards. So bear all of that in mind. Let's go to the first of these letters. There's two of them. They're both very, very short. LifeSite published both of them in English, which is appreciated, so I don't have to translate them myself. First is by Father Joachim Heimerl, and he says, Francis' synodal church is controlled by old James Martin types of men. Remember, this is a relatively young priest who is seemingly trying to go out of his way to get canceled by Francis. He's almost certainly going to have that happen to him at some point. He is a priest from Austria. The Austrian hierarchy there is marginally better than that of the German bishops. So here is his letter. We have to be careful with it for obvious reasons. Pray on this one at your masses today. There are men who are likely lonely callers in the desert, and we know from the Bible that it is usually the Spirit of God that rests on such men. Joseph Strickland, the emeritus bishop of Tyler, Texas, who was unjustly deposed by Francis, is such a man. He shares the same fate as the prophets of the Bible, namely, that no one listens to him. Yet millions now listen to Bishop Strickland, only his fellow bishops do not. When Strickland recently asked them to finally take a stand on the fact that Francis no longer teaches the Catholic faith, his words fell into silence. No one dared to come forward to support the Texan who spoke the truth so fearlessly. No bishop in the U.S. and certainly nowhere else. Nevertheless, what Strickland said remains true. Francis stands for a synodal church, and with it a new faith that is no longer Catholic and which must be decisively rejected. No one is obliged to believe in a synodal church. On the contrary, the traditional faith of the church forbids this. While the bishops remain silent about all this, the superior of the German district of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX, clearly called a spade a spade. He describes the Pope's synodal church as diabolical, a betrayal of Christ's mission, and anti-gospel. But no one is bothered by this either. In the ranks of the bishops, a voice from the Society of St. Pius X is listened to even less than the one from Texas. Instead, the silence of the bishops orchestrates a polyphonic apostasy, that of the Pope and a large part of the Catholic world, and it almost seems as if this is a new normality. But where does the indifference of those who are appointed guardians of the truth come from, and who do not serve God with their silence, but with Satan, the father of lies? See the letter of 1 John chapter 3, verse 8. Could their apostasy have arisen out of nothing? Hardly. It had probably been latent for a long time, and it only took a pope like Francis for it to finally become visible. The controversial document Fiducia Supplicans, which was published a year ago, perhaps shows this most clearly. In it, the Pope himself permitted the blessing of irregular couples, meaning the blessing of James Martin pairings and those violating their normal marital vows. In the eyes of Holy Scripture, such a blessing is an abomination and blasphemy. Nevertheless, the document has remained in force to this day, and the minor resistance of the bishops was stifled from the outset. The significance of Fiducia Supplicans is therefore twofold. The document is the Magna Carta that most conspicuously documents the bishop's general apostasy, and it marks the visible forces that have been at work in the church for far too long, the numerous James Martin types among the bishops and cardinals. It is certainly no secret that the clergy has traditionally been infiltrated by these types, even if they are reluctant to speak openly about it. This also applies to the higher clergy. Serious estimates, the absence of reliable data, put the figure at a good two-thirds, and even if it were less, which I don't believe, the church still upholds an unprecedented record. There are many reasons for this, above all sociological ones. Among the older clergy in particular, right up to the Pope's generation, there is an above average number who have escaped social reprisals for opting for celibacy. Today, things are different, at least in Western societies, and the James Martin types stranded in the priesthood and especially in the episcopate are now vehemently pushing behind the scenes of the Vatican for the church to open up to the new course. To put it bluntly, the church has fallen into the hands of older James Martin types of men. It is only against this backdrop that it is understandable that the Pope made possibly the egregious with fiducia supplicans, and at the same time encountered so conspicuously little opposition. Very few people cared about the blessing of sin and apostasy from God. Most of them obviously identified with it long ago and deliberately instigated the document under the leadership of Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez. Since then, at the latest, nothing has been the same. What is commonly known as the James Martin heresy has taken the church with the Pope's approval, and more bishops and cardinals are now hypocritically claiming that they have suddenly learned something new in a synodal process of listening. They have understood, as if by a miracle, that the James Martin sin is willed by God and is by no means a sin, contrary to revelation and the 2,000-year-old teachings of the church. An astonishing change, don't you think? Or is it not more likely that all these prelates were just seizing the opportunity to finally justify their predisposition and approve it with the help of the Pope? Who else could promote the James Martin heresy, if not those most reverent gentlemen who are themselves of that inclination, and who are only driven by it and not by the Holy Spirit? It is as inconceivable as it is true. The church is in the Babylonian captivity of the James Martin senior clergy, who, starting with their heresy, are now gradually installing a new pseudo church, precisely the one that Bishop Strickland warns us about, the Pope's synodal church. The bark of the church is thus experiencing something like the mutiny on the Bounty, but with one crucial difference. The captain himself is here with the mutineers, and the men who, like Strickland, close themselves off to the James Martin mutiny almost have their backs to the wall. Meanwhile, the Antichrist reigns in the house of the Lord, and the Pope himself has erected an idolatrous altar to him with fiducia supplicans. It will not be the last should Francis remain in office for much longer. I would disagree with all those who attest that Francis is not the legitimate Pope, and that this is the only reason why these hair-raising conditions are possible. There is no other Pope but Francis, but it probably took a Pope like him to expose the workings of Satan in the Church and take it to the extreme. Yes, Francis is the legitimate Pope, and he is Pope not to the glory of God, but to the eternal shame of the Apostolic See, which he has desecrated with fiducia supplicans. And yet, perhaps, God only wanted to make the disfigurement of his church visible through Francis in order to restore it through a worthier successor of Peter. Who knows? Until then, it is important to listen to the voices of the right men, namely those who do not represent the James Martin heresy and thus their own disposition, but who, like Bishop Strickland, are the voice of God. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. See Matthew chapter 11, verse 14. I know some people tuned him out as soon as he said he believed Francis was legitimate. I understand that. But again, this priest is going to find himself canceled. Almost certainly. At this point, though, I don't know what it would do. I mean, he'd be able to probably contact Vigano because he's in Europe, or maybe the SSPX for support or something. It seems like the type who would probably do that if need be. Now, the other letter we have, and even much shorter than that one, is from Bishop Eleganti. He's a retired auxiliary bishop from the Netherlands, and he's taking on the other sacred cow of our time. There's a live site published this one as well. Headline, Bishop Eleganti. Women taking priest roles become formless, we'll say, and bureaucratized. This is, he's essentially saying that this is obvious. What he's going to say here, by that headline, should be pretty obvious that what they're doing is unnatural. It's defying the order of things as God established them for his church and for society more broadly, but for his church at the very least. And just because a priest or a bishop is retired does not mean he is immune from being canceled. He could be canceled himself. Bear that in mind. Um, as Pope Benedict XVI told Peter Seewald, Hans Kung wanted a church where the laity would have the same voting rights as bishops and priests as early as the 1960s. He understood the church synodally as a democratic council, a concilium. The term in brackets formed the template for the journal with the same name. There's a modernist journal called Concilium. There were two factions of modernists at the council, Communio and Concilium. The Concilium were the much more progressive types. Think the Chardin fans, basically. They were the Concilium. They wanted radical change in the church. The other were Communio, founded by Joseph Ratzinger and others. They were the sort of the very conservative post-conciliar group of things. But they, before and during the council, they were all allied together. It's just the old rule of revolution. After a revolution anywhere, the new political order is always breaks into what can be two factions. It might be, in a parliamentary system, 15 different parties on each side, but they always end up forming basically the same coalitions, depending how their processes work out. One that we can say is on the left and one that we could say is on the right. And you see that here in the post-conciliar era, which is one of the reasons why I have such a hard time with Vatican II, is because the after effect of it is a secular alignment politically. Big problem with that, because that's not how it should work in the church. Anyway, he says conservative theologians responded to this with the journal Communio, which understood the church not democratically bottom up as a sociological entity, but sacramentally top down from the Holy Eucharist as a hierarchically organized communion of unequal but equally dignified people. Based on these memories alone, it is easy to see how the idea of egalitarian relationships between laity and clergy in synodal assemblies and committees, deliberative co-determination, is not new. As with Luther, this form of synodality is based on baptism, is considered higher than ordination. However, this does not improve matters as the deconstruction of the sacred consecrated priesthood continues unabated. Without priests, however, there will be no church. Until they disappear in certain regions of the world, priests will be downgraded to the mere head of a liturgical assembly and made the moderator of pastoral care teams or the coordinator of committees, commissions, and groups. In many places, they have already delegated these tasks. At the same time, lay people are jumping into the places the priest has vacated, instead of taking their place in society. They bless graves while priests and bishops stand reverently and idly by. The clericalized layman, who no longer wants to be called a layman but a pastoral worker due to his theological expertise, takes on the task that the priest performs on the basis of ordination without being ordained, a development that was already foreseeable at the end of the 1970s when the profession of pastoral assistant was introduced. I'm going to pause here. He is taking a diplomatic uh, sort of poke here at the phenomenon of lay theologians, which are fairly new in the life of the church. They're not quite a post-conciliar thing, but they were definitely leading up to that kind of thinking. And now there's a million and one lay theologians out there, some of them better than others, but on balance, probably not the best development in the life of the church. And he is outlining at least one of the big problems here with them. Linked to this is a progressive desacralization of the Holy Mass into a group experience and themed service. The sacrifice of the Mass has become a foreign concept as it requires an ordained priest to offer it. Instead, we have a widespread liturgies of the word by full-time lay people who also administer communion, which does not require ordination, only an unseen priest who has consecrated the hosts beforehand. That happens a lot, especially in Europe. For the reasons mentioned, there are fewer and fewer priests. The marginalization of the priest is progressing so much so that that its necessity has been seriously questioned during the synodal path in Germany. This leads us to the second point. Hans Urs von Balthasar already wrote in the 1970s, quote, if today this fruitful tension is weakening between the Marian and Petrine elements because Mariology is being deprived of its position, and if women are being forced into hierarchical offices in the course of the democratization of the church, then they will only be jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. The post-conciliar church has largely lost its mystical features. It is a church of permanent discussions, organizations, committees, congresses, synods, commissions, academies, parties, pressure groups, functions, structures, and restructuring, sociological experiments, statistics, more than ever a male church unless it is a formless entity in which women will conquer their place to the extent that they are ready to become such themselves. That's Hans von Balthasar for you right there. How right he is. This is because the woman allows herself to be bureaucratized to do what a cleric, or bishop or priest, did before within the hierarchy of the church, up to the highest Vatican offices. Thus, in Balthasar's sense, she becomes formless and a functionary, not very mystical, but happy to share in the power of men in the church. This does not make the church more feminine, nor does it make it more servant-like. For a feminine church, the woman in it would have to live differently from the man, more mystically, without striving for the tasks or functions previously exercised by him. The same applies to the full time layperson, who, without ordination, wants to do everything like the priest. He too loses his own charism and fails to maintain his proper place. So now we encounter women at all hierarchical levels of power, the wrong category in our context, in Balthazar's sense, a process of self alienation of women and the church at the same time. In fact, the two are connected. It's amazing how blind everyone involved is. In the ordinariates, for example, there's now a female chancellor, and everyone thinks that the church and women's issues are making progress. We're now waiting for deaconesses, a potentially foreseeably small group compared to the majority of women in the church, which is not really relevant for the position of women in the church. But we're not there yet. For my part, I even believe that they will never exist, but perhaps a kind of unconsecrated, dedicated deaconess who is given priestly functions or tasks without being a priestess or consecrated deacon, similar to the incense dispensers of the new Mayan rite. Symbolically speaking, the Tower of Pisa is not going to straighten anymore. The problem is its foundation. In other words, we have had the wrong structural approach for 60 years. As Bishop Marian Eleganti going after the sacred cow that is Vatican II as the source and summit of these problems. Those are your two letters for this Sunday. Before we wrap this up here, because it's a Sunday, we will go and check the live chat here. So, you have any thoughts on this? Let me know in the live chat. Yes, as Dr. Obvious says, the Notre Dame opening ceremony was horrible. The organist was a horrible Keith Emerson wannabe. The Purple for Incense was a 70s disco ball, but the choir salvaged the clown show, even sang Latin hymns. Yeah, we'll talk about that, I think, maybe tomorrow. I feel vindicated noting some of my displeasure at some of the ways they renovated the inside of Notre Dame with that consecration ceremony, the mass that they offered, and how everything was. It was bad, very, very bad. All right, folks. Just remember, today is the feast of the Immaculate Conception. If you have, check your diocesan website to know if you have to go to mass tomorrow, because a lot of bishops waived it. After Rome imposed it, a lot of bishops said you don't have to do this. So check your diocesan website. But also, as Eric Salmon said on X a couple of days ago, it does seem like the church would like you to go to mass on Monday. So if you are inclined or able to do so, but not required, consider it. Thanks very much today for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.